I feel like that there is a campaign underway and has been for a long time to erase the religious underpinnings of the founding and the intentions of the founders. And I know as a child growing up, Gen X in the 90s, my take on everything was like, just, I want to do whatever I want. I want to be free. And I want you to be free to do whatever you want as long as it doesn't impact me. And I thought at that time that setting people up to be as free as they would like, except if it touched my nose, right? The famous quip, that would be enough. But I'm starting to maybe think that freedom isn't to do whatever it is that you would like, but rather freedom to do a certain specific type of behavior, to live your life in a certain way that was unavailable to people, which is why they, in revolution or colonial times, which is why they actually came to the United States, was to actually express their religion more profoundly, more deeply, to live it in a more, obvious and public way. Now, how do you share that sentiment that maybe I was misled in my education about the separation of church and state and what the purpose was and what the purpose of freedom is? Like, the freedom as discussed by the founders wasn't to just go run amok. It was freedom to do some things that you ought to do. Has there been a campaign to erase that? And I'm feeling confused. Is that, whose fault is that?
Well, there's definitely been a campaign, but before that campaign started, there's a great essay by Paul Johnson, whom I think is one of the greatest living writers. His book, Modern Times, is probably my #1 book. If I had to say what's the best book that you could send anybody to read, it'd be Modern Times. But he had an essay called God and the Americans, which was a extract or an excerpt from his History of the American People. And as he pointed out, this wasn't, the founders were here in 1776, and then Jefferson writes his letter, and then it all changes. This was a very slow evolution. By 1800, many states were still paying ministers. The states were paying ministers. Justice Story in 1828 says that this is a Christian nation in one of the leading Supreme Court cases. All the way up until 1898, the Supreme Court is referring to America's Christian tradition and so on and so forth. So what happens, as Johnson points out, is as you started to get more sects, S-E-C-T-S for all of you weirdos out there, you get the Christian Scientists, you get Seventh-day Adventists, you get the Mormons, you get the Methodists, the Free Will Baptists. As all these start to come in, how do you handle this variety of religious difference in the public square? And Johnson points out that, and this is confirmed, by the way, by a number of religious historians, you start to get this transition from a very specific kind of Christian background, i.e. Puritan in the Northeast or Anglican in the South, to a generic Christianity that can agree on a bunch of moral principles, a bunch of general moral principles. And that becomes what's taught by about 1830 as you start to roll forward. So by the time you get to the 20th century and the influence of Marx and Darwin and all these other things, there has been a significant movement away from a very narrowly defined Christian nation to a much more broadly defined Christian nation that is basically kind of a watered down Christianity, because it accepts almost everything that we can accept without causing a problem.
Right. Accept everything that we can accept without it causing a problem, except the causing it a problem part, I think, is changing in that equation and seemingly getting worse. I struggle with this. I went to George Mason, I studied economics there. I'm well-versed in libertarian thinking. They beat it over my head. It was the first time I had heard taxation is theft. The guy was describing it to us, as though the modern the genesis for modern government and taxation was some warlord in the state of nature ran around and killed everybody, took all their stuff, and was like, wait, there's nobody else's stuff left to take anymore. Maybe instead of going around killing them all, I'll just keep them alive and then come by and take a little bit every year. And that's where it all came from. And the guy with such fervor at the podium, this is my freshman year, right? Banging the table, spittle coming out of his mouth. I will never forget that. So I understand libertarian thinking, and I thought that that was it for me. But I have talked to so many other people and seen the consequences of freedom as running amok versus freedom to do what you ought to do, that I'm personally having issues just trying to discover what that really means, you know, considering the concept of freedom as an avenue to do what I should do, rather than
when you were describing that guy, the scene of Eli Wallach as the bandito in The Magnificent Seven, where he was talking about why he doesn't take everything from the townspeople and go, oh, we leave them some of their chicken so they can stay alive next year to give us more stuff, you know?
Yeah, I mean, he seemed to make that case pretty strongly, but now I'm evolving to understand that freedom isn't, what is the word? Licentiousness? I can't pronounce it. Licentiousness. It's not that, which I'll admit, as personally, I definitely took a hedonistic approach to life for some time. And then it began to ring really, really hollow. And then you see the consequences of other people doing the same thing. And then I feel an urge, I'm called towards something a little bit greater. And I'm exploring that. And I can see how other men throughout history, the greatest men of our nation, they understood that the calling was to do something better with that freedom rather than to just enjoy themselves.
Well, you know, also, it's very important to understand when you're reading any of these people that as humans, we go through phases of our lives. Alexander Hamilton, for example, in Cherno's fantastic biography, was very religious as a young man. His college roommate remembered Hamilton praying for hours on his knees. Later in life, Hamilton starts to fall away from his religion. And what's odd is he comes back to it right before his death, even though his death was totally unexpected and at quite a young age. So people go through these phases in their lives where they say, all right, I'm gonna do whatever. You know, hey, I was in a rock band. I know what that's like.
Yeah. Right. Fascinating. Are you yourself a Christian, sir?
I am. And I was raised in the Southern Baptist Church, and I kind of gravitated more into a Pentecostal faith. I believe faith works, and I have enough evidence to show that it absolutely does. And so I could tell you some minor miracles that have happened in my life that would just raise your eyebrows.
Well, I ask because I want to ask you another question, which is I'm thinking of a quote from Hamilton, which I found to be extremely based. He says, you have to fit the government to the people like you would a cloak to the individual. Now, the implication there is that not everybody around the world is suited to the proposed form of government that they were making at the time. Along with that, there was the assertion that people, Christianity was that set of values and virtues and guidance and morality that we needed in order to have a successful version of this proposed government. But I am not a Christian. I'm not a theologian. I don't know any about this history. So I'm asking a very genuine, basic question here. Is there an element, a universality to Christianity? Like if you ask somebody, should everybody be Christian? And if so, or if not, are people at various times appropriate for Christianity, not appropriate for Christianity? And the reason I'm asking is how do we square, if there is a universality to it, how do we square a universal notion of Christianity, if it exists, versus fitting the government to the people like a cloak to the individual? To me, those seem to be in tension with some sort of conflict. Help me out.
Well, I don't see a conflict there at all. And I do think that God prefers, God's will is that everyone would come to him through Jesus Christ. That's his will. The old pygmy in Africa. What about the pygmy in Africa? Hey, it's not my job to decide what happens to the pygmy. You know, I'm not getting paid enough to make that decision, right? So that's totally up to God. And We have lots of evidence from the Old Testament that God accounted it to people's faith when they did not know the Messiah, who hadn't come yet. Nevertheless, God accounted it to them for righteousness. So he said, okay, you can't know what's coming, so I'm going to make it as though you did, and I'm going to chalk this up to your credit. But Hamilton's comment, I think, is a little bit different than what you imply. I think he's saying that we need to be practical, and that at the particular time, this is the type of government that would work best with this situation. I would argue that, for example, in colonialism, most of the colonies still were not ready for independence. And that was the British view of, we can't give them independence. They're not ready for independence. The British view was they were never going to be ready because they were never going to be British. That's what they never said. Same thing with the French. Our view is a little bit different. They weren't ready because they had not ever adopted the basics, the pillars that are required to make a republic work, which is an understanding of common law, an understanding of private property with written titles and deeds. And so this is Hernando de Soto's argument in Mystery of Capital. He says, why are there still poor people? Don't they have stuff? George Carlin's famous routine about stuff. And he says, yeah, they got stuff. The problem is they don't have written titles and deeds. And they can't prove they've got stuff, so it makes it very hard to leverage. And in Africa, you have all of these tribal claims on land and so forth. So it's going to be very hard to advance economically if you don't have the right foundations. I mean, over and over again, whether it's the Bible or in common sense, if you don't have a good foundation, you're going to fail.
Indeed. And these 4 pillars of American exceptionalism also happen to be right square in the target of the 1619 Project on all fronts, trying to erase the value, erase them from history, tell people that they were all based in slavery and in taking advantage of people and creating systems of oppression, which is why they're definitely socialist, communist energy infused in there, Marxist for sure, an assault on private property rights. I'm sure it's baked into their ideas. It's explicit in their language, and it's obvious in their practice where they would like to take that one day. No surprise that they're coming after these 4 pillars of American exceptionalism.